Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey you guys, welcome to Knowing Animals, the podcast. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. ASA is a fantastic organisation. It works very hard to support animal studies scholars, just like myself and like my guests, but ASA relies on membership subs to run. So please have a think about joining ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Okay, well, this episode of Knowing Animals is coming to you from Mexico City, where I'm attending the Minding Animals conference, and I'm really excited to be able to bring to you Professor Will Kymlicka. Now, Will no doubt will be known to every single person who listens to this podcast. Will, of course, is a political philosopher and he's based at Queen's University in Canada. And today we're going to be discussing his book, which he wrote with Sue Donaldson, called Zoopolis, A Political Theory of Animal Rights, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2011. Welcome to the podcast, Will.
Thank you.
So, Will, can you start by telling us why you wrote this book?
Yeah, Sue and I have been thinking about writing something on animal rights for a long time. We've been vegans for 30 years or so. And we weren't just quite sure what was the most productive or constructive way of contributing to the debate. And then we read Martha Nussbaum's book on Frontiers of Justice. And that's really what inspired us to take up the book project, because Martha offered a very important and insightful discussion of how animals fit into theories of justice. But we thought that she skipped over some difficult questions and tried to impose basically a single model of what justice would require in our relations with animals. And both Sue and I had the intuition that we needed a more differentiated model, an approach that recognized that different groups of animals would have different kinds of relationships with us. And so we tried to think about what a framework would be to make sense of those relational obligations.
I can remember very clearly, I think I was in the late stages of my PhD when there's kind of a bit of buzz among the animal studies community that your book was coming out, and there was much anticipation because, of course, you're very, very well known for your work on multiculturalism, and there was much anticipation, how is Will Kymlicka going to deal with this issue? And you turned to the citizenship principle, I think, perhaps primarily, if please correct me if that's not fair. Can you tell listeners how you use the citizenship principle in relation to animals?
So the first thought is that in order to understand our distinctive obligations to domesticated animals, we need to recognize the fact that we have made them members of our society. So the first thought is about a membership. That we need to acknowledge the membership of domesticated animals in our society. And as a political philosopher, the category that political philosophers use to discuss membership is citizenship. And citizenship has been a very important concept in my work from my PhD forward. And I've always thought that citizenship has it both has a certain kind of symbolic function in acknowledging membership, and it also provides a framework for thinking about mutual obligations. And so I'm just naturally attracted to thinking in terms of citizenship as a status and as a framework for thinking about rights and responsibilities. And because I've worked on issues of multiculturalism and minority rights traditionally, I've also thought that citizenship is more flexible than many people think. Many people have the idea that it's part of the very definition of citizenship that it's a unitary and homogeneous status, that that to be a citizen is to have the identical political status to every other citizen, whereas in the societies I've studied in my work on multiculturalism, I've always been focused on the fact that there are actually multiple forms of citizenship, or what I've called group differentiated citizenship, and so that indigenous peoples, for example, often have a different legal status than settlers. And there may be linguistic minorities or national minorities who have distinctive rights and status. And so citizenship, I've always thought, has a kind of unexplored potential to, on the one hand, acknowledge shared membership, and on the other hand, acknowledge difference. And we want to explore whether we can make use of that in the animal case as well.
And I think one of the very important contributions that you've made, certainly the one that I hear people deploying as though it's natural, as though we have all agreed on these things, is you've categorised animals into various types of groups. Can you say something about what those groups are and what they mean in citizenship terms?
Right. So as I've mentioned already, we're starting with domesticated animals, because those are the animals that we have the most direct and intensive relationship with, and they're also the ones that we most intensively exploit and oppress and harm. So there's a sort of urgency to think through the case of domesticated animals, and we use the category of domesticated animals to refer to all animals who've been domesticated. So that includes companion animals, farmed animals, many lab animals, and so those are the ones whom we say we have brought into our society, and whom we need to think of as members of a shared society, with whom we have genuinely relations of sociability with. But most animals on the planet are not domesticated, and so and there I mean, hundreds and thousands of animal species who are not domesticated, and there's it's hard to know what are the most, and there are many differences amongst these non-domesticated animals. But for our purposes, we divide them into two big categories, one of which we call wilderness animals, or truly wild animals, which are those animals who live as far away from humans as possible, who live on their own habitat. And we suggest that we should think of those as forming their own societies on their own territory, and we should recognize them as having the right to live autonomously on their own territory. And so we should think of them as if they form other nations, and that our relationships with them would be modeled as a kind of intersocietal or international relations. And then the second set of non-domesticated animals are animals who live in physical proximity to us, and who have learned how to adapt to living in human environments. So urban wildlife, most obviously. And we call those liminal animals because they're kind of in between the truly wild animals who live away from us and the domesticated animals who I've brought into our society. These liminal animals, they exist in physical proximity with us, so they share physical space with us. But because they're not domesticated, they're not tamed. They're still free-living animals. And so they're not really part of we don't really have social relationships with them. We're not really part of a shared scheme of social cooperation with them. So our suggestion is we should think of these liminal animals as basically they're co-residents, but not members of a shared social scheme. And so we call this, we use the term denizenship to capture this category of urban wildlife who have rights of residency. It's these days, the city belongs to them as much as it belongs to us. And so we need to learn to physically coexist, although we don't have the same social relationships with them that we have in the case of domesticated animals.
Wonderful. So we've got a bit of a picture. We are talking about citizenship, and we're talking about different types of animals who we relate to in different ways. What then does your theory mean for us in terms of what we owe those animals, or the kinds of rights or protections they're entitled to?
So I should say right off the bat that this is an animal rights theory, and so we start from the premise that all sentient animals have a bedrock of basic rights that are universal and that don't depend on their relationship with us. So that any animal, whether they're wild, whether they're truly wild wilderness animals or urban wildlife or domesticated, all animals have certain basic rights not to be killed, not to be experimented on, not to be held captive, and so on. So those rights are universal. But then we have a second level of rights which do depend on the structure of our relationship with animals. And so you could think of these as so there's universal rights at one level, and then there are relational rights at another level. And these relational rights vary with the nature of our relationship. And so in the case of domesticated animals, as I say, we should think of them as members of a shared society. So this society belongs to them as much as to us. And so we need to make sure that the rules that govern our shared society are as responsive to their interests as to our interests. And that's fundamentally a political challenge. We need to think about how do we create collective decision-making processes that to determine the shared rules for our shared society that are as responsive to their interests as to ours. And I think, we have... we're at ground zero on that question. We've never really accepted that the society belongs to them as much as to us, and so we have these very minimal anti-cruelty provisions, but they don't even start to get us towards the picture of shared citizenship that we're thinking about. So it would have implications for public goods, public services. So for example, we think that domesticated animals should have access to publicly funded health care. They should be covered by labor rights, and there should be mechanisms of political representation. So we have a very robust story about what would be the relational rights that flow from shared membership for domesticated animals. In the case of truly wild animals, wilderness animals, these relational rights include territorial rights or habitat rights. And so on our view, wilderness belongs to the animals living in that territory. It's their land, not ours. So we have no right to develop that territory, no right to settle on it. So we need to accept territorial rights for wilderness animals and autonomy rights. So this is a bit more complicated what exactly these autonomy rights would consist in, but basically we think that we should acknowledge that wilderness animals are competent to lead their own lives, and that we should minimize interference in their ways of life. The case of liminal animals is in some ways the most interesting and most challenging. What do we owe to urban wildlife? And so, generally speaking, I think our obligation is a kind of live and let live tolerance that because they're not domesticated, because they're not tamed, we shouldn't imagine that the goal is to establish these kind of intimate cooperative relations with urban wildlife. I don't think that's the right image. We basically just need to learn to live and let live. And that's largely a kind of passive tolerance. But we also need to be very conscious of the potential for our decisions to have costs and to impose risks on urban wildlife. We need to be very conscious and try to minimize any risks that we impose on them by the way we build roads or fences or the glass on buildings and so on. So we need to think about the costs that we're imposing on them and try to have some sort of conversely, they impose some costs on us. Urban wildlife can sometimes be nuisances and pests. So we are entitled to take certain measures to mitigate the risks they impose on us, but we need to mitigate the risks we impose on them. So a large chunk of the issue about justice in our relations with liminal animals is, I think, about thinking about these reciprocal forms of risks and how do we reduce them.
So your work ties in very closely to well-established liberal principles, well-established political principles Do you hesitate at all to tie the well-being of animals to these founded, established liberal principles, or do you think that that's a priority? It's a good way to approach it?
So, I think I have both a strategic and a philosophical reason for appealing to liberal principles. The strategic one is just that's the world we live in. Liberal democracy is hegemonic, and our constitutions are framed in the language of liberal democratic values. So if we can't connect animals to those, they're just going to continue to be marginalized or ignored. But it's not just strategic. I actually think philosophically that liberal principles can actually be useful. I mean, that it's actually that the logic of liberal principles should, if interpreted consistently and in good faith, should lead to animal rights conclusions. And so, I mean, if that's right, that raises the puzzle about why have liberals historically not been more sympathetic to animal rights. And that's an interesting question that I've struggled with over the years. Why haven't liberals historically been more sensitive to the animal question? And some people think that liberalism is committed to valuing human rationality and human autonomy as the defining characteristics of what it is to be human and what it is to have value, and so that liberalism is kind of inhospitable to the animal question because liberalism privileges and prioritizes reason and autonomy. And this would be a long conversation, but that there certainly is that is one strand of liberalism. But on the other hand, a second strand of liberalism has been preoccupied with the question of the justification for the exercise of political power, the submitting of that liberalism is fundamentally about coming up with criterion for the legitimate exercise of coercion. And liberalism starts from the idea that no one has a natural right to rule over others, and so that there are special burdens of proof or justification for anybody who wants to exercise power over others. And from my perspective, the way in which humans treat animals is just a paradigm instance of the tyrannical exercise of political power. So from my point of view, I've always been puzzled. I would have thought if you're a liberal and you think the fundamental, political task is to stop tyranny and to hold those who exercise power accountable to those over whom power is exercised, if that's a fundamental impulse of liberalism, then the animal question just seems to me obvious. The animal question seems to me it's the most blatant example of the unaccountable exercise of power, that we exercise this extraordinary power over all animals, but particularly domesticated animals, and we've made no effort to ensure that that power is exercised in a way that's responsive to the interests of the animals. And as I say, it just seems to me a paradigm case that liberals should care about. And I think the reason why liberals have historically ignored it is not really because they're liberals, it's because they have shared in a broader human supremacist philosophy that is equally found amongst conservatives, amongst Marxists, amongst Aristotelians, and so on. So it's not their distinctly liberal premises that have led them to be to ignore the animal question. It's just the broader Judeo-Christian, Greco-Roman supremacist beliefs.
Yeah, look, I agree with you entirely, and my sense is that part of the task is to demonstrate why these principles fit well and should be respected. And I think it probably is self-serving short-sightedness, but I do see within liberalism something positive that we can latch onto, if only we can persuade people to truly embrace the project that they profess to support. So, Will, can you say something about how your book has been received, perhaps both among animal studies scholars and perhaps beyond?
So Sue and I have been very pleased, I have to say, with the reaction. It's been picked up. As our ideas have been taken seriously. I mean, since we were relatively new to the field, we weren't sure what the reaction was going to be, and we could easily imagine people just dismissing it. And it certainly is. It has some. It's an unorthodox account, let's say. But it's an unorthodox account both of liberalism and of animal rights, and so we could have imagined people being quite dismissive of it. But in fact, in our experience, people are taking the ideas quite seriously and engaging with it, including here at Minding Animals. I'm very pleased with the fact that people are engaging with our ideas. We had the hope of influencing the debate both within the animal rights community, but also within mainstream political philosophy. And I'd say we've had more success engaging with the animal studies and animal rights crowd, which have really welcomed us, and in many ways. Mainstream political philosophy is still resistant to the animal question, and so I've come to think that that's now a longer term project. So, I would like to. My goal would be that the day will come in the not too distant future in which anyone who's learning political philosophy that part of everyone's education and training in political philosophy will be to encounter the animal question. I want that to be seen as central to whatever position you end up taking, that you would nonetheless see that the animal question is central to the field of political philosophy. We're not there yet, and it's still the case that most textbooks, for example, in political philosophy don't mention animals. I periodically check that to see whether, but even there, I start to see some movement and some progress. So we're still very far from the center of the discipline, but we're not quite as at the extreme margins that we used to be.
And you're not finding that the political philosophers of Canada forget to invite you to their conferences nowadays? Or?
No, I think there's partly a generational issue here that I think younger scholars realize, partly because attitudes towards animals may be changing, but also because of the environmental question, that they're recognizing that an old way of framing the topic of political philosophy just is inadequate to the challenges that we face as a society and as a planet. And so I get the sense that, again, whatever their particular view about our theory is, that people are looking for a form of political philosophy that is adequate to the realities that we live in a bio, that we live on a planet, that we are ourselves embodied animals living in an eco, all that stuff that is just invisible in so much political philosophy.
Wonderful. Well, Will, I ask everybody who comes on Knowing Animals to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Well, I think it was Mary Midgley's Beasts and Man, which I read as an undergraduate, not because it was an animal study. I was working at the time for a paper on social biology. Had a moment of influence in the 1980s, and I read Midgley's book as an account of how we should think about the role of biology. Really, that's what the book was on. Why we should avoid biological reductionism when we think about ethics and political theory. But in retrospect, I realized that Midgley's book actually had quite a bit of influence on me, because she was very skeptical about the way in which people drew distinctions between humans and other animals. And so there was a whole kind of rhetoric of human uniqueness and human exceptionalism and human supremacy that she just kind of inoculated me against, and I think that has stuck with me.
Wonderful. So can you remember the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Yes, it was a co-authored piece with Paola Cavalieri, who's an Italian animal rights philosopher, and she, I had mentioned in a review of Brian Barry's book on theories of justice, I had mentioned in passing that on his account of how we should think about justice, animals should be included. And it was a kind of passing reference. I mean, but Paola read that and contacted me and suggested that we co-write something that would explain in more detail why a particular approach to justice, which Brian Barry called justice as impartiality, why that would require including animals. And so we wrote a paper called Rethinking the Social Contract that talked about how a kind of broadly Rawlsian framework of justice's impartiality should include animals.
Fantastic. So, Will, if you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Well, as I say, in retrospect, Mary Midgley has stuck with me, and she didn't really develop a systematic animal ethics in the way that others come to mind. I think she did a more effective job in deconstructing some of just these basic cultural tropes that we're all raised with and that circulate about distinctions between humans and animals. And I think it's. I've always felt that the obstacle. I admire the work of Singer and Regan and others in deconstructing some of the philosophical arguments for human supremacism, but in my experience, it's the obstacle for animal advocacy is not only these philosophical arguments. It's just a lot of kind of knee-jerk tropes that people have about animals and how they differ from us, and I'm continually struck by how when we're presenting and getting questions from the audience, people are coming up with these tropes that Midgley had demolished 30 years ago, but they still circulate.
If only we had better memories.
Yeah.
So, Will, what's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
Well, one task is simply to legitimize the animal question as a profoundly important question, worthy of scholarship and worthy of public debate. I mean, as you know, there's some people still think that some people trivialize the importance of animals, and some people seem to think that it's only overly emotional people who exhibit concern for animals. And so I actually think universities have failed in the past. I think one of the tasks of universities is to kind of to make clear which issues deserve our attention. I mean, so that's one of the tasks of academia, is to basically identify what are the pressing issues and challenges we face as a society. And so I think academia needs to highlight the animal question as a fundamental one. There's a secondary task within each discipline is to, so in philosophy has been the source of many of the anti-animal beliefs and assumptions and principles. So, I mean, philosophy has a lot of, cleaning its own house to do. So one task of philosophy is to we need to unlearn a lot of the philosophy we've been taught for 2,000 years. And so it's, on the one hand we need to raise this question as a legitimate question, but we also have to unlearn a lot of what we learned.
Wonderful. So, Will, final question. If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human relationship, what would it be?
Well, I mean, it's hard to know what there's, kind of chicken and the egg problems here about what comes first. I think the fundamental goal has to be to recognize that animals are somebodies, not some things, in the slogan, and I think it's a good slogan. And so people need to be able to see that there's a somebody there, that there's someone home in animals, that they are individuals who have their own subjectivities and their own lives to lead. How we get there is this hugely complicated question, and it really isn't clear to me which of the many strategies are going to be most effective to get there. I do think that the fact that animals are property under the law is a fundamental obstacle. I think that legally sanctions and encourages and reproduces the perception that animals are things, not individuals. And so, unlike some people, I don't think that the property status of animals, if we got rid of that, it wouldn't solve all the problems. That's not the only problem we have, but I do think that's a fundamental one that we need to address.
Wonderful. So, Will, what are you working on next?
Yeah, well, Sue and I are working on another book, and there are different parts of the story we're trying to develop, but in particular, we're trying to think about what an interspecies democracy would look like. And so what would democracy look like if we recognize that animals' interests count and that animals have a right to a say in how they are governed? We don't have effective mechanisms for representing interests, and we don't have effective mechanisms for animals' agency or voice or participation. And we've got some ideas about how to change that, and we think there's some interesting experiments on the ground that we're trying to learn from. But that's the next big task, is a kind of an account of interspecies democracy. Wonderful.
So how can people find out more about your work?
Well, most of our work is posted on my academia site, so I'd encourage people to just look at that and download any of the papers that are of interest.
Wonderful. Well, Will, thank you so much for joining us for the podcast, and thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and on Facebook, and to leave a review on iTunes. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.